Welcome to tonight's webinar. Tonight we're talking about confident decision making in social work. So if you're just joining us for the first time, fantastic. If you've been with us all the way through, that's brilliant as well. And if you just like to join us every now and again, that's okay as well. So as well as the basics, kind of where are you in the world, what's your connection to social work, you'll know that we always ask you a question. So as tonight we're looking at decision making, I'd like to know, how confident are you with your decision making? Is it something that you feel really comfortable in? If so, you'd score yourself a 5. Or is it something that you really struggle with, or you're just learning, so you would score yourself a 1? So if you could pop in the chat where in the world you are, what's your connection to social work, and then also how confident do you feel with your decision making? So over to you, Siobhan.
Fabulous, thank you very much. I love that, the numbers, and I really liked watching the numbers coming in, but I tell you what I particularly loved, there were a few people, in fact one of our very own team members, Tony, who said, I think I'm a 2.5. Well, to be honest, if you can't decide whether you're a 2 or a 3, you think you're a 2.5, it probably is that, because it's kind of like, I can't even decide what score I am. Just really made me giggle, I think. So decision making is being clear. I have decided to allow my new puppy into the room with me tonight for the first time, because the last couple of weeks we've done webinars, she's cried all the time from the kitchen. I've allowed her into the room tonight. I am about a 1.5 confident that that was a good decision, but that's a particular decision. So we'll see how it goes. I may run out of the room quickly and the team will cover for me. I shall be back very soon if I have to run out of the room. But tonight we're going to be talking about confidence in our decision making. So it's a back to basics session. You know, sometimes we do like to just go back to the basics. It's fabulous when we have the amazing guests that we do, but sometimes we just like to go right back to basics, and that's what we're going to do tonight. On social media, the last few days, we've been posting pictures of trees and asking people why trees might relate to the topic tonight. And there's lots of reasons why trees might relate to the topic tonight. But Helen Shepherd, straight away online, Helen is our, you know, I think she's come to every single webinar. I think a couple of weeks ago she was on holiday and she said I won't be there. And then she joined us from the hotel pool. I mean, this is how committed Helen is. And Helen said on social media, decision trees, and it is really all about decision trees. That's one of the reasons that we're going to talk about trees tonight in relation to decision making. So I don't really know a lot about decision trees. My daughter, the daughter who does most of the drawings and images for the slides that we use, Rosie, she is she's into maths and science, and so she introduced me to the idea of decision making trees. They're used a lot in maths. They're based on mathematical algorithms, widely used in science, engineering and industry. They are designed in a very mathematical way. There's normally loads of graphs and calculations and all of that to support decision making. We don't really do that in social work, do we? We don't draw on. I told you it was a bad decision. She's throwing a bone around the floor already. So we'll keep that in there. Thank you. So apologies for that. We don't tend to draw on maths in our decision making in social work, but increasingly algorithms and decision-making trees are being trialled in social work, largely social work with children and families in England. There's a lot of use of algorithms, looking at things like ACEs, adverse childhood experiences, doing some mathematical calculations around that. They're being used quite widely, really. Media coverage on the use of those kind of predictive data systems did result in really significant concerns within the profession. I mean, you know, I've no research behind that. I can't say 27% of people were dissatisfied, but what I can say is through letters to the press, social media posts, it was really clear that lots of people were quite concerned within the profession about the use of algorithms and data and an over-reliance on that for the future of social work. However, what I think it's really important that we do as social workers is we don't say that's no good, we're not going to do it, because actually the world is becoming more reliant and using systems and data a lot more than it did in the past. So I think what we need to do as social workers is be clear about how we utilise much more nuanced decision making, much more individualised decision making. But we also do draw on data, on what data is able to offer us. So my view is that the development of a decision-making tree, which is specific to social work, could be helpful. And that's what I'm going to try and offer you tonight, is a decision-making tree. But it's not going to be mathematical. It's not going to be based on algorithms, because I'm no good at maths. I was never any good at maths. But it's going to be based on the idea of trees. Trees and social work have lots of connections, actually. And I don't just mean in the kind of very stereotypical way of, you know, social workers like hugging trees or whatever. I mean, actually, we've got lots of connections with trees. Just thinking about the complexities of practice. I mean, look at that tree. It's hugely complex, in the same way that social work can be hugely complex. Sometimes things in social work feel very risky, and we feel like we're a bit on the edge and it's all a bit precarious. But reflection, as it shows in that picture, always helps. I think there's also a link here in that we can't always see the future as social workers, but we can help people open up options and pathways. I think there's some beautiful pictures of trees here, and I just wanted to share them. The weeping willows look shows us about the emotional context of practice, which we really need to think about in social work. Social work is all about offering support and protection to help people, promoting growth. I think even, this is probably my favourite image, even a single leaf can offer shelter. So sometimes as social workers at the moment, we feel like we have nothing to give. There's no resources, there's nothing that we can give. But even a single leaf, even a belief in somebody, even kindness in communication can offer a lot of shelter for people. Trees are often described as the lungs of the earth. I don't understand the science, but I think they give us oxygen back or something. And I suppose it made me think about, what about the lungs of our practice? That's all about values, isn't it? And the value base are perhaps the lungs of our practice. Trees also reflect change and diversity, which is key as part of social work. And thinking about the changing seasons and the way that trees often change within the seasons, we know in the next month or so, trees are going to teach us about the importance of being able to let go. And letting go can be a really difficult thing, but actually in social work is key. We've got to be able to let go. We've got to be able to switch off in social work. There's complex root systems that we have within social work. There's so many connections, and it's not just roots, but also branches. And I think a couple of people said that on our social media posts about why we're using trees tonight. Also, though, trees can bring communities together in ways that social work can too. There's some cultures where people come together to admire the blossom of the trees. I think it's beautiful. People who plant trees plant hope. I think that's a lovely phrase, and it really does mean a lot that people who plant trees do plant hope. But things are not always as you would imagine them. You know, within social work, things are not always as you would imagine them. I was once asked to plant a tree. It was a great honour to me. In the hospital services where I started my social work career a few years ago, I was asked to plant a tree on World Social Work Day. There was lots of people there. Look, they put a ribbon round I mean, it was marvellous. I had all these expectations of it looking beautiful and me looking all dignified, and it absolutely wasn't. It was really hard work, and you look at that photograph and it looks nothing like all those beautiful photographs of celebrities planting trees. So trees have a lot of connection with social work. We can develop decision-making trees for ourselves, but not based on algorithms, not based on data, based on the knowledge that we have within social work. A social work decision-making tree should be based on theory, should be based on research, should be based on evidence, and should be based on expertise. And that's what we're going to look at tonight. We're going to look at each part of the decision-making tree and how we can reach confident decisions in social work, how our decisions can be defensible, how we can feel confident in the decisions that we've made, drawing on what should be the social work decision-making tree. So we start with theory. The webinars that we're doing, and I think did we say at the beginning, this is number 94. In fact, we only have 6 left after tonight because we've made the decision, perhaps like the leaves falling from the trees, that we need to let go at some point, and we're going to go up to 100 sessions. The whole idea of the sessions in the first place was to help people to make connections between theory and practice, and between reflection and practice. The webinars were all about theory and critical reflection, and theory has such a lot to offer us in social work. We know that, don't we? It has such a lot that it can offer, and yet we very often allow it to slip off our professional agenda. We're so busy. How often do we think about the theory that we're using, the theory that informs our practice? In previous sessions, we've talked a lot, many times, a number of times, about the difference between theories and models and methods and approaches. So specifically, you know, a theory is about our thinking and our understanding. A model is about our doing, our action, what we do. An approach is about the overall way in which we go about doing something. And a method is a specific skill or technique that we might use within our practice. So really, specifically, when we're talking about decision making, we are talking about drawing on theory, because it's about our understanding, isn't it? It's about what do we understand that we can draw on in this decision. We might use models of decision making. There are particular models that we can use of decision making, and there might be particular methods that we use within our decision making. And actually, I'm going to come back to that and look at some particular methods that we can use. But it is theory that we use as the first branch of the decision making tree. What do we understand in this situation, and what might it make us think about the situation? As a practice educator, and I saw in the chat at the beginning that we have lots of practice educators here with us in the session tonight. As a practice educator, I very often ask students, what theory are you using there? And I usually get like a terrified rabbit looking back at me in the headlights. In fact, I asked that question just yesterday of a student, and it was a terrified rabbit looking back at me in the headlights. And yet by the end of a placement, students often feel much more confident about that question because they know I'm going to ask it them regularly, and they often feel that they can answer the question with more confidence, more fully. And yet just when we start to feel more confident with theory, often we don't get asked about it anymore. Often once you're qualified, nobody's going to ask you about theory anymore. Interestingly, a number of local authorities are now bringing in expectations that social workers will refer to theory in their decision making and in their record keeping. It's really important. Theory is the basis in many ways of our decision making, and that's why it's the first branch of the tree. The next branch of the tree is research, but every branch branches off in different directions. So there's actually 2 different sub branches, if you like, of this aspect of the decision-making tree. In our decisions, we should use research findings, but we should also use research skills. So the research branch has 2 things. If I were to ask you to think about a decision that you've made today, doesn't matter what the decision is, but think about a decision that you've made today. What theory have you utilised? So I've made the decision to allow this pup to stay in the room whilst I'm talking to you. What theory have I used? Well, I've thought about attachment and the secure base and the fact that, you know, she likes to be around me and she gets a bit anxious if she's not around me. So I've used a theory. In terms of research, then I don't have any research that says, is it safe to have a puppy in the room whilst you're delivering a webinar to lots of people? But I perhaps should have used my research skills and made a different decision. We'll see by the end of the webinar. often students dislike research modules. It's probably the module that most students complain about. I think this team, I think if you're honest team, I'm looking around at the cameras, I think if you're honest team, the biggest complaint in the WhatsApp group about modules is always about the research module. The biggest sort of questions, the number of the difficulties, the concerns, it's always about the research modules. And I think that that's been ongoing for years and years and years. It's rarely people's favourite module. And yet learning research skills is probably more important now than it ever has been within social work. I'm not certain that they're always clear with you about that in research modules. I don't think they're always clear about why you need to develop these skills, these research-based skills. But it isn't just about, here, read these 2 journal articles and do a comparison. You know, you're actually learning to be a social worker when you're doing that. So in terms of the 2 branches of research, using research findings is really helpful for social work in a range of different ways. When we're drawing on particular forms of research, findings from research, then it really helps us in understanding the likely outcomes in a situation, making predictors, if you like, so understanding risk indicators and protective factors and thinking about what might happen. It also helps us to think about the likelihood of successful change. What's actually going to work in practice, maybe what isn't going to work in practice. Research can tell us all of those things. But you've really got to take a critical approach to research. It's vital. You've got to think about the power dynamics, the context, all the stuff we've talked about when we talk about critical reflection is exactly the same when we think about critical evaluation of research. So when you're drawing on research in your decision making, where is the research from? What methods were used to determine this research? How reliable are those? What was the motive behind the research? Who funded it? Who carried it out? How near to practice is it? And all of those will have an impact on how valid and useful the research is going to be for you in making your decision. But perhaps the most important question you can ask, and you know that I talk constantly about the importance of the why question. Perhaps the most important question you can ask yourself is, why have I used this research? Because sometimes people make the decision first and then go and look for the research that's going to back it up. Your tree's going to fall over then. I mean, it doesn't work. We then tend to ignore any information that challenges the findings of that research or the decision that we've made. If you practice like that, you're called verificationists. You're simply verifying your decision by seeking out some research. What we need to do is look at all of the research, as much of the research as you can. And some local authorities, some social work employers will assist with that. They'll give you access to research and maybe offcuts of research so that you can make your decisions. But get used to drawing on research in your decision making when you're a student, because that's when you've got the time to be able to explore the research. But the second sub-branch, if you like, is about using research skills. In many ways, what you are doing as social workers is you are action researchers. You're basically, when you're doing an assessment of somebody, you're researching the quality of their life. You're researching how safe somebody is. You're researching, when as a practice educator, I think of that I'm researching the quality of a student's practice. It's research. That's what we do. It's what we do every day. It might not be what you feel like you do when you're in a research module, but it's what you do every day. You're gathering information. You're analysing that information to reach a decision. You're communicating that decision and you're making recommendations. And that's basically the research process. If you look at standards, in England, there is a set of, I think it's the Research Skills Council, have a set of standards for researchers to follow. They are incredibly similar to the standards for social workers. When you look at them, the skills that are required for research are very similar to the skills that are required in social work. Research is all about developing a hypothesis, saying what you think is happening, and then testing that hypothesis out. That's what research is about. Those of you who've had to do research proposals or research projects will know that's what you're starting off with. That's what social work's about. Social work is about having a hypothesis, what you think is going on, and then testing it out. We're going to return to that use of research skills when we move into the other branches of the tree. But so far, we've looked at the use of theory in reaching a decision. We've looked at the use of research, but the two sub-branches of that are using findings from research, but also using research skills in your decision making. The next branch of the tree is all about evidence. Now, there's a big movement in social work about evidence-based practice, and people tend to use that phrase interchangeably with research-minded practice, evidence-based practice, and it gets muddled and people think it's one and the same thing. So very often, practitioners think of evidence as the research findings that they're drawing on. That's the evidence that I'm drawing on. But actually, in the tree that I'm suggesting to you tonight, research and evidence are in different branches. So the evidence isn't the research that you're drawing on. Research is really important in decision making, but it's a different branch. Evidence is really about this specific situation that you're working in. What is known in this situation and how do you know it? What evidence have you got about what's going on in this situation? What do you actually know? And this is where things like safe uncertainty come in. There's some things that you don't know, and there's some things that you might never know. What is it safe not to know, and what is it unsafe not to know? We've had people asking us recently about what is safe uncertainty, so that's why I thought I'd bring that in. But evidence is really about what do you know in this situation and how do you know it? And this is where we draw on a key research skill, actually, and a technique of triangulation. Now, triangulation means lots of different things in different contexts and particularly in different professions. So map makers use triangulation, engineers use triangulation. Triangulation in research is about validating the information or the data by cross-referencing it from more than two sources, hence the triangle. So if you're going to say, here is a fact that I know from research, you've got to get it from more than two sources, and that's what creates triangulation. In forensic science, then triangulation is all about the types of evidence that we draw on in reaching decisions. So we were looking at forensic social work last week, and I think sometimes people come along thinking it's going to be like crime scenes, you know, investigation stuff. But actually, this is what comes from forensic science that we use, triangulation. There are really only three sources of evidence in anything that we do in social work, and they're the triangulated evidence. There's quite a bit of research behind why triangulation works and what makes it helpful. So right back in 1997, then Carvlow and White said triangulation goes further than validation because it offers a deepening and widening of your understanding, especially in complex situations. It produces innovation and creativity by providing a range of interpretations around information. It enriches the evidence that you've got. It prevents the potential for bias, and it can confirm or refute or explain evidence. So what does triangulation mean in social work? How do we use triangulation to evidence our decisions? What's the evidence that we're drawing on? There are literally only three sources of evidence. And as I talk you through this, if you're a student on placement, you'll recognise this as the evidence that you have to present so that your practice educator can make a decision confidently. If you're thinking about when you're writing an assessment or you're writing a case record, the evidence that you provide before the analysis comes from this triangulation. There are really just three sources of evidence. The first one is observation. What have you seen? What have you actually seen? Now, this is at the top of the triangle because in a way it's almost the strongest source of evidence. If you've actually seen it, that's a really strong source of evidence. Although sometimes we only see what we want to see, and sometimes people only allow us to see what they want us to see. So it's not always the strongest evidence, but we've got evidence of what we've actually seen. In forensic science, that would be you've seen it, okay? You've seen it yourself. The next source of evidence is feedback evidence. So we can get feedback from other people. In forensic terms, that would be seen as third-party evidence or witness statements or testimony. Someone else has seen it and they're telling you about it. So when you're making a decision, you might be drawing on observation, on feedback. And then there's also product evidence. Now, in forensic terms, that would be, I mean, I'm not a forensic scientist, but as I understand it, that would be your DNA evidence or your fingerprints or the products. In social work, whether we like it or not, the product evidence is paperwork. So the products that we're drawing on are things like the research article that we've read, or the specialist assessment that we've read from the occupational therapist, or this bit of theory that we've read, or the chronology that we've taken a look at, or the previous case notes. And that's how we reach a decision. So I've told you about this decision, which isn't a social work decision, but was a personal decision, although it's about my professional life, I suppose. Although these are my evenings, this is, me giving up my free time. But my decision to allow this puppy to stay in the room tonight was based on observation evidence of she tends to go to sleep at night time and just lie down. If I'm in the kitchen with her, she'll just lie there. So I was thinking, I've seen that. Feedback evidence, some of the team members said to me, oh, it'll be all right. Yes, my puppy's done that. Yes, it's fine. The product evidence is she is literally behind me at the moment eating some paperwork that's really important. So I'm now going to change my decision based on what I am watching now and observing now, feedback that she's giving me that she doesn't like this presentation that I'm giving. She's not interested in it and she'd much rather eat the documentation that lies behind me. That is it's actually a load of cards that I have written to people to say, welcome to the course that I'm going to send out to people that she's now eaten. I'm going to have to rewrite. So my decision based around that, I can even see Di's face there. My decision based around that is I'm going to leave you with the team for a moment to talk about the triangulation. I'm going to take her in the kitchen and then I'll come back. So I think what we need to recognize is that when we reach decisions, they're not always deterministic. We can change our mind with help from others. So I'm just going to mute myself and take the puppy into the kitchen where hopefully she'll go asleep, and I'm going to hand over to Kelly and see what Kelly's going to offer. As an original team member, Kelly is good at covering and she might bring others in. I'll be back in 2 minutes.
Thanks, Siobhan. So I didn't really realise that triangulation would be part of tonight, but it does seem really obvious, doesn't it? And I learned about triangulations in the theory cards. It was laid out really nicely, and I did use it a lot on placement. So I used it when I was working with a family, and I was kind of like what I read about them, what other people told me, and then when I kind of went to see a person and I put that all together to give me a bit of a picture, it showed me kind of from different aspects. So my kind of experience of triangulation in that kind of environment has been a little bit limited. But I'm thinking that, Chris, is this something that you use in so if I'm talking about kind of children or like drug and alcohol work, it's going to be quite different to adults, isn't it? So kind of how would you use it in your work, do you think?
Yeah, it's interesting because now I look at that and I think, well, actually I do use that without really realising that I'm using it. And I think that's so often is the way, isn't it? But I'm thinking about a situation. I've been working with somebody recently where I've observed things and I've looked at all the feedback and I've taken all the evidence into account and actually been able to make decisions based on all of that, which has had a really good outcome for this particular individual. But having that evidence base and taking all of it, everything from every angle, putting it in there is what has made the difference. So yeah, recognizing what you're doing for what it is, which I'm not always very good at.
So you're doing it, but you just don't know you're doing it.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it's got a name. Yeah.
Yeah, it does.
We do that, don't we? We do that a lot.
Yeah, definitely. I see Siobhan's back now.
Thank you, Kelly and Chris. It didn't take me long to take her and put her into the kitchen. But I think that's my decision made now for, sometimes you have to test things out, don't you, to know whether the decision was the right one. The hypothesis was she'll just sleep in the bed down there. But the actual experience was that once she realised I was talking, she could get up and wander around and eat what she liked, then she did. So we'll continue now to move through triangulation. If you're a student, you will know that's how your practice educator makes decisions about you. Your practice educator is going to observe you. You need to get feedback from people that you've worked with, and they will look at that feedback, they will seek feedback, and they will look at the product of your work. So they'll read some of the recording that you do. They'll read your reflective writing, and that's how they will reach a defensible decision about your practice. So triangulation is something that we use all of the time. I think, as I heard, Kat, I could hear what you were saying even as I was trying to walk her through to the kitchen, but what I heard you saying was it is something that we use all the time, but we don't necessarily think about it. But that's how you've reached a decision. Now, there is a model which, if you've been to our webinars before, you will be familiar with, because we've had a whole webinar session on share as a model. But share is essentially a triangulated model. It's a multisensory model, but it's triangulated. It's a way of helping you to reach decisions. When you reach decisions using share as your model, then you've triangulated. Share is effectively what's going to give you the evidence for your decision-making tree. Because the evidence is, what have you seen? What have you heard? What have you done? What have you read? And how are you evaluating all of that? That's basically your evidence, isn't it? And it's triangulated because seeing is what have you observed? Hearing is really your feedback. What have you heard from other people? And reading is your products. So you've got that triangulation within share. So the evidence for this part of the tree, the evidence part of the decision-making tree, is what have you seen? What haven't you seen? But you might also want to look at, well, what are your blind spots? Because that's where your bias comes in. Maybe what you haven't seen. What do you think a good outcome would look like in this situation? Hearing, what have you heard? What haven't you heard? Who from? Whose voice is the loudest in what you're doing and in your decision making? Whose voice has influenced you the most? How have you kept the person's voice at the very center of everything? Especially if the person's not verbal. How do you hear them? And how do you keep that voice central? In terms of action, what have you done? What have other people done? What impact has that had? Maybe what hasn't been done. In reading, theory, research, previous notes that you've looked at, have you recorded it clearly for other people to read? All of this is about your decision making. And then in terms of evaluation, how are you evaluating it all? What's important? What isn't important? How do you know that? What's worked well? What hasn't worked well? What conclusions can you draw? So this is really about how we can pull together the evidence in this particular situation. So in the tree, evidence isn't the research. That's the R part of the tree. Evidence is what do you actually know in this situation, and how do you know that? Lots of times I hear people basing decisions almost on what I would call stories. They're telling me what other people have said, or they give me a story, this has happened, that's happened, this has happened. And if I stop and say to them, how can you evidence that that has happened? How do you know that that has actually happened? They're not always so clear on that. It's the story. Unpick your story. What's the evidence? How do you know that? And that's the evidence part of the tree. Then we've got expertise. Now, this is key and really important for us to think about as social workers. There's quite a lot of work around the study of expertise. So Jan Fuchs, who you know, does a lot of work on critical reflection. A lot of her writing is around criticality within social work and critical reflection. So Fuchs, Grimes and Hawkins identified the study of expertise and expert practice is highly controversial. Professions can be criticised for dominance over and disempowerment of the constituency that they are ostensibly servicing. Basically, what that means is, do we as a social worker set ourselves up as the expert? What makes us an expert? The very notion of being an expert is disempowering to other people. Because what you're doing is you're saying, I'm the expert, you're not. You disempower others. Who is the expert in this situation? Why are they an expert? So when you're drawing on the expert, good social work recognises that. Good social work recognises the sort of contested nature of expertise within social work. People are experts in their own situation. You cannot be an expert in somebody else's situation. You have to be able to put yourself in the shoes of that person. They have the expertise. They know about themselves. They know what's going to work in their situation. That's the expertise that we should be drawing on in our decision making. We've got a long-held view that people are the experts in their own situations within social work. Increasingly, we are starting to recognise that people with lived experience of systems can add a lot to the evidence base that we draw on. We recognise that as a team. It's why every single season we make sure that we have guests with lived experience. Every season. And often they're the sessions that we learn the most from. I think I have learnt more from listening to people who have experienced things than I have from reading all the theory books, going to all the lectures, sitting in, you know, all the training. I will learn more from having a conversation with an individual about their experience and their expertise. So actually, in many situations, really, everyone's an expert. They've got an expertise on a different angle, but everybody is an expert in a different way. So, for example, you might have a social worker could have expertise in the systems that support families or into how to navigate systems. A health visitor could hold expertise about child development, maybe about health and well-being. A teacher could have expertise in the educational context for a child. The family's got expertise about their circumstances. The child has expertise about their experience and what's happening for them. So we're all bringing some expertise into the decision-making process. So when we get to this branch of the tree, it branches out in lots of different directions. Whose expertise are you drawing on in reaching this decision? Professionals that are involved, all of the different people involved in the family, and how are you drawing on their expertise? So in terms of this suggested decision-making tree, drawing on expertise calls for you to consult widely with everybody who's got expertise in the situation. And you also need to draw on your own experience or practice wisdom. Perhaps the most important thing is it requires you to be attuned into the power dynamics and who has the expertise in this situation, bringing some humility into your decision making. It's not about saying, I don't know anything. It's about saying, I hold expertise in this area and you hold expertise in that area. And that's how we create effective working relationships with one another. When we come into a situation we're setting ourselves up as an expert, then people are not going to respond to us. People are not going to want to spend time with us. When we demonstrate that everybody has expertise in a different area, then we're showing some balance. So I'm hoping that looking at the tree as a whole gives you an idea about decision making. That whole tree, we draw on theory, we draw on research, we draw on evidence, and we draw on expertise when we reach decisions. That's just giving us a decision making tree. There are many other methods that we have in reaching decisions. I remember really vividly, because I think it was a great presentation in our record keeping webinar, which is a great webinar to watch back. Actually, I'm surprised it's not more popular in terms of the watchbacks on YouTube. But the record keeping webinar, we had some really good guests at that, talking about how you record decisions in your record keeping. And I remember Richard Devine talking about, it draws from Signs of Safety, but talking about how we need to think about 3 things we need to think about when we're looking at making decisions about risk, particularly. We look at the first, the worst, and the last. So the first time this situation happened, the worst time, the worst outcome that there was in that, when that thing happened, and the last time it happened. And that's how we reach decisions about risk. It's a great framework, really simple, easy framework. I would say that would give us the theory part of the tree, because what that draws out of signs of safety. But I don't think it can stand alone. And I think very little in decision making in social work can stand alone. We're very often in social work now being given these, well, if you work in adults, you'll know about the decision support tools. You know, there's lots of decision making tools that we use a lot in social work that we're told this will help us reach decisions. They're very often based on some kind of algorithm, some kind of data, some kind of this makes it high risk, that makes it low risk. But actually, everything in social work is nuanced. It cannot be about tick boxes. In social work, we've got to draw on the theory, the research base that we have, the evidence in this particular situation, because this one particular situation might be different to everybody else's. It's unique and complex. And then we've got to draw on everybody's expertise to reach a decision. The whole tree is important. All of that, the decision-making tree, all the illustrations actually, they're all in this book, which I think we've referred to before. I've only just added this slide in, so I haven't got it on my printout, so I have to move the screen to remember. The title is Working Towards Accreditation, Putting the Pieces Together. That's not ever what I call it, see, so I had to look at what the title was. It's a workbook for children and families, social workers. I think some of the team have it, some of the audience might have it as well. But that draws on, well, that's where the decision-making tree is based. If you wanted to reference it for an assignment or something, then you would reference it into that book. But that book draws on the whole tree. So in that book is all of the theory that children and families, I mean, it's a big thick book, but there's a lot of theory for children and family social workers. There's a lot of research findings in there. There's descriptions about how we use research skills in there. There's lots of evidence and toolkits for gathering evidence and so on. So if you felt tonight was useful to you and you wanted to look at it more, then that book is available. You can get hold of it. And I suppose I'm mentioning it because it's on a special offer at the moment, because we know that people are starting to go on children and families placements, and we've got newly qualified workers going into ASYE. So hopefully tonight has planted some seeds in terms of what a good decision-making tree might look like in social work. Now, you might think there's something else that's missing from the tree. You might want to add in something about the leaves and the roots and the branches and some of the knots that you get in the bark. I've just given you the tree, the theory, the research, the evidence, the expertise. But decision making takes a forest. You can't do it alone. You've got to make decisions with others. Decisions have to be shared within social work. So we take our decision making into supervision. We take our decision making into team meetings, into case discussions, into core groups, into family group conferencing. So decisions, we need to think about the decision making forums that we utilise and the forests that we create. There is a fabulous phrase about trees that I love, and I think we've used before in some of the webinars, but I think it's a great quotation. When the roots are deep, there is no reason to fear the wind. I think that's really important. I think it's really key. I know that this is, if you like, the season when students are just starting social work. On Friday, it will be 36 years to the day since I arrived at university to start my social work journey. So 36 years to the day on Friday. I know it was the 30th of September because it was my mum's birthday and she cried the whole day dropping me off. So I remember exactly the day. And it's 36 years since I started social work. So on Friday, 36 years. There's been lots of challenges along the way. There are always lots of challenges. But it's been the best journey of my life. Social work is the best profession in the world. It can take us in so many different directions, as we've looked at over the last couple of weeks. It helps us to meet amazing people like the team behind the webinars. But those challenges can blow us off course a little bit. And I think the message, when the roots are deep, there is no reason to fear the wind, will help those of you who are coming into social work as new students, but also those of you who have just graduated and are going in as newly qualified social workers. Keep focused on your roots. Why did you become a social worker? What's your route into this? What's your reason for it? Because those roots are the things that will keep you secure as you go through the journey. It's the roots of the tree that keep the tree standing. So when the roots are deep, there is no reason to fear the wind. It's a lovely phrase, really lovely. It was some newly qualified workers that introduced it to me many years ago now. And I thought, I need to look back at that, don't I? I need to research it a little bit so that I can see who I need to attribute it to, who I need to reference it to if I want to quote it. There was nowhere to reference it to. It's an African proverb. There's so much we can learn from African proverbs in social work. Prospero Tedham's written a whole journal article on what we learn from African proverbs in social work, but it's an African proverb which is amazingly helpful. When the roots are deep, there is no reason to fear the wind. But when I went to research it, I did come across this. I don't think it's a real picture. I think it's a computer generated image because I don't think we're supposed to really know very much about it. It's operated by NASA in America in the Arizona desert. This is the Biosphere or Biodome project. It's like a massive giant Eden project. They're trying to replicate an environment that could be wholly self-sustaining. Everything worked really well, except trees. Trees didn't grow. And they couldn't work out why trees didn't grow. They spent ages trying to decide. They theorized for hours, apparently, the scientists did. And then they realized why. They hadn't replicated wind in the biodome. They saw wind as being wholly problematic, so they wanted to eradicate wind because they thought that was the problem. But actually, the trees couldn't grow without the wind. The trees simply grew to a certain height and then they toppled over. And what we learned from that is the roots don't bed down without the challenges. It's challenges that help roots become deeper. Without the wind, everything's very surface. So the challenges that you face on your career, the challenges that you're going to face on placement, they are what help you to dig your roots down deeper. Keep focused on your why, and that will help you to dig your roots down deeper, because that wind will help develop a much more complex root system. So we do need the roots in social work to make those confident decisions, to have the confident decision making trees, but we also need the wind. So there will be challenges. There'll be challenges to your decisions. There'll be decisions that you make that you need to change along the way, as I have done tonight. There will be decisions that you make that you might look back on and feel, I think that was the wrong decision for me to make. But if you've got a framework that you've made the decision on, that you can defend why you made that decision at that time, in that moment, with the information that you had to hand, that's what you need to be able to do as a social worker. You need to have confidence in your decision on that day. So hopefully tonight has been helpful. I'm looking in the Q&A. I can't see any specific questions. I think the team's probably answered them as they've gone along. So I have seen a couple of suggestions in the chat about decisions. I'm sure Ian, I think I saw Ian Lawrence putting something brilliant in earlier, as Ian always does, because he always has something fabulous to offer. But I'm sure that I saw something and I can't find it now in the chat because the chat moves so quickly. So decision making, hopefully it's given you a little bit more confidence in the decision making tonight. Here are the last lot of webinars we've got. It's quite sad now, isn't it? It's almost like those trees dropping off, the leaves dropping off the trees, because now literally every webinar we have left fits onto that one final slide. We only have 6 sessions left. We do hope that you'll join us for those 6 sessions. Next time we have got the amazing Maureen. Maureen is just so skilled. And she's going to come and share her research. She is partway through her PhD looking at female genital mutilation. It's such an important topic for social workers to be aware of, but also to think about how we approach it. And some of the decisions that Maureen has made around her research are really interesting, and she's going to be sharing that with us next week. And then we're going to do another back to basics, finding principles for excellent practice. We're going to try and summarize what we think of as the bases, the building blocks of excellent practice in social work. So there's the sessions coming up. I think the team's probably put into the chat things for the things. I can't even get my words out tonight. I'm really tired, sorry. The links, there we go, links. I couldn't think of the word, there we go, but the links to the next few sessions for you to be able to register. Hopefully tonight has given you some seeds to think about. Those who plant trees plant hope. So go and plant some decision-making trees and plant some hope in social work. Hope is the most important thing that we can ever have in social work. There's no such thing as false hope. There is only false reassurances. Thank you very much, everybody, and good night. See you next week. Bye.